WVOX.
Welcome back to the Sons of the American Legion Radio Report on WVOX AM 1460 and heard around the world on WVOX.com. We have a special guest on the line, but first, here's Ken.
Hey, thanks, Jack. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Sons of American Legion Radio here on WVOX 1460. And an important piece of legislation was approved by Congress just before Memorial Day, that being the Department of Veterans Affairs Mission Act of 2018, approved by both the House and the Senate, but still waiting for signature from the President, so we'll see about that. But we have an expert to tell us about what is in that bill to help veterans, and that's our friend Rory Riley, an attorney, has served on the House Veterans Affairs, House Representatives Committee on Veterans Affairs, and also the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims, and a graduate of Holy Cross in the neighborhood. Rory, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, very good. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. Now, first off, I kept looking for the signature on this bill, and the House and Senate approved it just before Memorial Day, which a lot of veterans legislation gets done Memorial Day week. It's topical. But then we didn't see a signature from the President. Is there a delay on this?
Well, Ken, I think you're not the only person who was surprised by that. As you noted, presidents often sign veterans legislation in and around Memorial Day just for the symbolic effect that has. I think that this has more to do with the White House and the fact that they have other things going on. There's Robert Mueller's investigation, the North Korea summit, and less to do with the contents of this bill. As you saw, it passed overwhelmingly in both the House and the Senate. So I think that this is a matter of the White House being distracted more so than an issue of the contents of the legislation.
Well, maybe we could just go through what it includes. It's basically replacing and providing additional funding to the Choice Bill, which enabled veterans to seek medical care from private practitioners, and also had additional funds for caregivers, and also set a standard for the Department of Veterans Affairs to pay the doctors on time who are the private practitioners providing health care. Tell us a little bit about what did you see in the bill?
So those are the major points that you just pointed out, and they're all important because even though VA had a community care program for years, there are a bunch of small different programs, and what this bill seeks to do is standardize those across the United States so that a veteran, no matter where they're located, has the same access to health care, whether it be at the VA or at their local provider. So one that you touched on is the ability to pay providers. When Choice was first expanded in 2014 as a result of the issues at the Phoenix VA Medical Center and other VA medical centers around the country, that was something that VA didn't have any experience doing, paying outside providers. So it was problematic in part because it was a new process that employees weren't used to. So now that we've recognized that problem, we've put steps in the legislation that will give VA the tools it needs to do that, because Choice can't be successful without providers in the network willing to treat veterans. So that's a really, really important step towards making sure that veterans have access to providers outside of the VA. One of the other things you touched on was the expansion of caregiver services. That's another thing that's really important, because when caregiver authorization was first provided a number of years ago, it was also a new program and something that people were unsure about how it was going to work in practice. So it was almost like a pilot program of sorts, and it was limited to post-9/11 veterans. Obviously, there are a lot of veterans who served prior to 9/11 who have catastrophic injuries and likewise require the full-time support of a caregiver. So that was viewed as an injustice to many pre-9/11 veterans. So this legislation remedies that by giving the same caregiver services to all veterans, regardless of when they served pre-9/11 or post-9/11. So that's something that's really important as well. And then finally, as we talked about, the big thing that this centers around is consolidating those community care programs into Choice. And one of the things that really jumped out at me that I think is really important in this legislation is a Center for Innovation, Care, and Payment, which allows the VA to set up different working arrangements with those in the healthcare community to see what works, what doesn't. Because as we saw with the legislation a few years ago, some of this is new to the VA and they just weren't sure, which is part of why we had the hiccups that we had over the past few years in getting veterans access to these outside providers.
Well, certainly there's a lot in this. It's over a number of years, but it's as much as $50 billion added to the resources of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Now, how is it anticipated that a veteran who would like to utilize this service, perhaps for routine medical care that they can get locally, or for a veteran who lives in a rural area like upstate New York, we have a lot of people who may not be close to a city where there's a VA facility. How is it anticipated a veteran would be able to take advantage of this program?
Well, first, as you touched upon, that is a lot of money. One of the main critiques of VA legislation in the past is that VA has been underfunded. Personally, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that there have been some issues in how to implement the program. But for people who have made that their primary concern, number one, there's a lot of funding going to this. So VA has the resources it needs to make this successful. Number two, for veterans, for example, in rural areas like upstate New York, as we touched upon, this does eliminate the categories that were previously in place for veterans to access their local provider. Previously, the veteran had to live either further than 40 miles away from their closest VA, or they had to prove that they could not get an appointment within the VA for 30 days. They had to meet one of those two requirements. And as you know, for veterans in rural areas, 40 miles in one location is not the same as 40 miles in another. If you have to take a rural highway the whole way, as opposed to if you live in a more rural area and you have access to a busy freeway system, 40 miles can take you a long time. So
Sure.
What this legislation did was eliminated both of those requirements so that the veteran has more choice up front in terms of where the care is that they want to access and what works better for them, based on things like you noted, where they live, perhaps what the condition is, if it's something routine versus something that's complex. So that, I think, is going to be a really, really good thing for veterans and for the VA moving forward.
Okay. And we're talking with Rory Riley, who is an attorney and advocate for veterans. And Rory, you had shared with me an article which we put out on our page on Rally Point by Sherman Gillums, who is with AMVETS, and it talks about how innovation can make or break VA healthcare. What are some of the key things that you see as far as innovation that the VA needs to do?
Well, in the Medicaid industry, what we've seen is providers and consumers working together on a concept called managed care. We haven't seen managed care within the VA yet, and basically what that means is that a company who manages the healthcare services receives a set amount of money, and so they either find a way to provide the care with that money, and if they do, everything is green. But if they don't find a way to provide the care within that set of money, they, the managed care company, will lose this money. And that's something that I think is really important, and I was glad to see Mr. Gillum raise that point, because with the VA, you keep seeing in the news, VA saying, oh, we're out of money, we need more. Oh, we're out of money, we need more. Well, managed care doesn't work that way. It's very successful in terms of providing quality care while keeping costs in check in the Medicaid space. So I think that's a really, really good idea to bring that to the healthcare system.
And still, as we talk about on the show, which always confuses me, is that TRICARE, which takes care of veterans who are 20-year retirees, is a separate system which has always been provided for by private physicians. And in fact, there's been some efforts to try to have TRICARE service provided by the VA in some cases. Is there any logic in why the two systems work independently?
Well, the main thing is that TRICARE is a DOD service. So in terms of who's in charge and who sets their policies, that is the Department of Defense. Even though there's some overlap between DOD and VA, they are two separate government departments. That's the main reason for the difference. And also, I think it's important to know, you had said that they've always had private providers in TRICARE, and that's actually not true. TRICARE didn't have access to private providers until 2001. And so I encourage my colleagues in the VA space to learn from the TRICARE experience that originally folks who were enrolled in TRICARE had to go to a DoD medical center, and they ran into the same issue. If they didn't live near a military base, they had great difficulty accessing the care that they needed. The staff at DoD heard these complaints, they adjusted their system. They have the TRICARE system that you just mentioned that we see now where there's access to private providers. So yes, it is a little confusing that they're separate. TRICARE is specifically for veterans who are retired from the military, where VA serves all veterans, whether they are retired from the military or just did a few years of service and then moved on to something else. But I think that the VA could absolutely learn from that experience, and that TRICARE has been very successful since they switched to that portability model.
And Rory, we just have about 30 seconds left. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about your company based in Charlotte, Riley Topping Consulting, and your work?
Sure. As you noted, I've done some work in the government space over the years, and now I help organizations who want to work on veterans issues, primarily in the areas of government relations, legislative analysis, and communication.
And where can they be reached? Where can you be reached?
My website is riley-topping.com, or you can find me on Twitter at rileytopping.
Very good. Rory, thank you so much. We'll look forward to having you join us again.
Thank you very much. I appreciated being on the show.
Okay. And John, Rory gave us some insight on this. I'm interested because my father passed away in 2004 after massive medical attention the last 5 or 6 years of his life. I always assumed he was getting it through TRICARE. Mm-hmm. And it's possible private health care was kicking in because he never went to a VA facility, I recall.
Well, you know, that was one of those things that you mentioned, that only started to come in play beginning in 2001. So it was an interesting development how that has evolved. Now that there's fewer VA facilities, they are having to go to more in the private sector to try and get these things accomplished.
There's also very few DoD healthcare facilities.
Yes.
Many fewer than VA.
Yes. You've been listening to the Sons of the American Legion radio report here on WVOX 1460 AM and heard worldwide at WVOX.com. I'm John Chuhran, along with Ken Kraetzer and Jack McGuirk, and we thank today's special guest, Rory Riley, an attorney and veterans advocate. Until next week, remember to thank a veteran.
From the world headquarters